The smell of grilled beef hit them first, drifting over the barbed wire fence like some strange omen. Yuki stopped walking, her boots sinking slightly in the Kansas dirt, and for a moment she forgot she was a prisoner. The scent was warm, smoky, rich, nothing like the thin rice gruel she had last eaten on Saipan before the surrender. She exchanged a glance with Aiko, the youngest of the women, whose dark eyes widened as if she, too, could not decide whether this was a dream or a trick. The guard waved them forward, impatient but not unkind, and they stepped into the campyard where other prisoners were already lined up. Sunlight pooled like gold across the ground, glinting off the metal trays laid out on the mess tables. No one had told them what to expect on American soil. On the transport ship they whispered of firing squads, of public humiliation, of hunger that would make their stomachs eat themselves. The propaganda back home had been clear. Capture meant death of the body or death of honor. And yet here they were, standing in a place that smelled not of blood but of bread. The wind carried the faint strains of a radio somewhere, bright American music, brass horns and swinging rhythm that sounded irreverent, almost joyful. Yuki clenched her fists, trying to hold on to the proper shape of her fear, but it was slipping away from her like sand through open hands. They were offered food before questions, which felt wrong somehow. A mess hall worker, a farm boy with sandy hair, set down a tray in front of Yuki and stepped back. On the plate sat a round bun, glossy on top, steam rising from where the meat peeked out. Lettuce, tomato, a slice of onion, and a strange red sauce completed the picture. It looked like no ration she had ever seen, and the sight of it was almost offensive in its abundance. Aiko sniffed hers, then looked at Yuki as though seeking permission to take a bite. Yuki bit first, because if it was poison it was better she discover it than Aiko. The taste exploded against her tongue. Fatty, salty, tender. The bread was soft as cloud, the tomato shockingly bright. She chewed, swallowed, and felt something loosen in her chest. Around her the others were eating too, cautiously at first, then with greedy relief. The camp cook, watching from the doorway, chuckled under his breath as though he'd just performed a magic trick. For the first time since capture, the women's shoulders eased. They were still in enemy hands, but the gesture was disarming, even humiliating in its kindness. Yuki remembered the last speech she had heard from an officer on Saipan, how the Americans would treat them like animals, how it was better to take one's own life than fall into their grasp. And yet here she was, sitting on a wooden bench with juice from the tomato running down her chin, feeling the tight knot of terror inside her give way to a confused kind of gratitude. The camp itself was plain but startlingly clean. Rows of barracks lined the yard, their windows open to the autumn air. Guards patrolled with rifles slung casually over their shoulders, but their faces were not twisted with malice. A girl named Keiko murmured that it felt more like a strange boarding school than a prison, and Yuki nearly smiled before she caught herself. Smiling at a time like this felt dangerous, like letting go of something she was supposed to keep clutched tight. The routine of the place began to show itself in small ways. The clang of a bell marked mealtimes, the whistle of a guard called work crews to the fields, the soft rustle of leaves filled the spaces between. The women slept in bunks with real mattresses, a luxury none had known since leaving home. Each day felt less like a prelude to punishment and more like a suspension, a waiting room between one life and the next. But the food, always the food, remained the strangest thing of all. They ate until they were full, which felt almost like a betrayal of those still starving in the empire. Aiko began to gain weight, color returning to her cheeks, and Keiko hummed softly to herself when she thought no one could hear. Even Yuki, who tried hardest to remain severe, found herself looking forward to the smell of supper. It was as though America had decided to win not by the sword but by the stomach, one meal at a time. Still, not all could be softened by bread and beef. At night Yuki lay awake listening to the prairie wind whistle through the wire, her mind circling back to the faces of the dead left behind. She wondered if accepting these meals made her faithless, if chewing the enemy's food meant she had already surrendered more than her body. Yet when the morning whistle blew and the scent of breakfast floated through the barracks, she rose with the others. That night, as the sun dropped behind the distant wheat fields and painted the sky in streaks of crimson, a truck arrived at the gate. The women stood watching as its doors swung open. More prisoners were being brought in, faces gaunt, eyes hollow, uniforms in tatters. The camp guards hurried forward, speaking in urgent tones, and Yuki felt her stomach tighten once again. Whatever ease the hamburgers had given her, it was about to be tested. Something in the air had shifted, and she sensed the fragile peace of the camp was not built to last. The newcomers brought silence with them, a heavy, choking kind that settled over the camp like dust. They were men from the Pacific Front, gaunt as scarecrows, their faces hollowed by hunger and malaria. Some limped, others carried haunted eyes that stared through everything. The women watched from a distance, struck by how war had stripped these soldiers down to bone and memory. The men's arrival changed the camp's rhythm overnight, as if the place had inhaled sharply and forgotten how to breathe out. For Yuki, the sight of them stirred a fierce, secret ache. These were the men they had been taught to serve, to follow to death if necessary. She caught one soldier's gaze across the yard, his cheekbones sharp as blades, his uniform hanging like rags, and felt her carefully rebuilt calm begin to fray. Aiko whispered that they would surely be punished now, that the men might resent how well the women had fared. But no punishment came. Instead, the guards simply expanded the mess hall schedule, making room for everyone to eat. The food became something more than nourishment. It was a mirror in which the prisoners saw their own divided selves. The women still ate hamburgers and bread until full, but now they did so with an uneasy awareness of the hollow-cheeked men across the room, who devoured their rations like wolves. Guilt threaded through every bite. When Yuki caught Aiko tucking half her portion under a napkin to share later with one of the sickly newcomers, she did not scold her. That night, Yuki split her own ration of bread into 2 halves and left one on the barrack step. By morning it was gone, and in its place sat a single scrap of paper with a hastily scrawled word of thanks in broken English. Something subtle shifted after that. The women began learning names: Hiro, Masao, Takeda, and soon they were trading words, first in whispers, then with quiet laughter. The guards did not interfere. Perhaps they understood that whatever war still raged beyond the wire, here it was being fought differently. Yuki noticed the way Keiko braided her hair again in the mornings, the way Aiko hummed not with fear but with something like hope. The camp was still a prison, but it had begun to feel, impossibly, like a community. Work assignments grew more frequent as autumn deepened, and Yuki found herself in the fields gathering corn beneath a sky that seemed too wide to belong to any single nation. The labor warmed her body and soothed the gnawing tension that had lived inside her since capture. One afternoon she caught herself laughing at an American farmhand's clumsy attempt to mime instructions, the sound startling her so much she clapped a hand over her mouth. The farmhand grinned anyway, tipped his hat, and for one fleeting moment Yuki felt the war vanish like mist. Yet the conflict inside her did not fade. At night she still lay awake, wondering what kind of woman would return to Japan after this, one who had eaten the enemy's food, worked their fields, even laughed at their jokes. The answer came sooner than she expected. It was late November when news reached the camp that Saipan had fallen months ago, that much of the empire lay in ruins under American firebombs. The men wept openly, some shouting oaths of vengeance, others sinking to their knees in silence. The women sat together in their barracks, the radio still playing its cheerful music somewhere outside, and the enormity of it pressed on them like a physical weight. Everything they had known was gone. The war was no longer something to win but something to survive. The next morning, breakfast was served as usual. Yuki stared down at her plate, at the neat sandwich and steaming coffee, and realized the choice before her was no longer whether to resist but how to live. She took a bite slowly, deliberately, tasting every layer as though it were sacrament. Across the table Aiko did the same, and their eyes met in a silent agreement. They would endure. That afternoon, as the sun sank in a blaze of copper light, the camp gates swung open again. A convoy of trucks rolled in, carrying not prisoners but soldiers, American soldiers, bringing crates of supplies. Among them was a box marked simply with a stencil, meat. The smell of fresh beef soon rose from the kitchens, carried by the wind until it hung over the entire camp. The men gathered, the women gathered, the guards themselves seemed to pause. When the first hamburgers were served that night, Yuki bit into hers and felt something inside her settle. It was not surrender. It was survival sharpened into resolve. The taste no longer felt foreign. It felt like proof that she was still here, still breathing, still capable of claiming life even in a cage. Around her, voices rose, soft at first, then stronger, as prisoners and guards alike shared the meal in the glow of lantern light. Somewhere beyond the fence the war still thundered, but inside the camp a fragile truce had been forged, one bite at a time. And as Yuki swallowed the last morsel, she felt the wind shift, carrying the smell of grilled beef far into the dark prairie night, as if the world itself was exhaling at last.